Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I welcome all of you to tonight's reading on this, the Lent Reader's Feast. Now, it was meant to be our first proper in-person event in Hall, and we were all so much looking forward to that. But unfortunately, the delay in the relaxation of the social distancing rules until at least the 19th of July has meant that we've had to change our plans. And instead, this is what is now called a hybrid event, delivered to a small audience in Hall, with other attendees doing so remotely. Indeed, this is one of the first occasions where we are using our new live streaming technology. So I keep my fingers crossed that it all goes smoothly. Now, as all of you will know, our Lent reader this year was Master John Mitchell. Completely unexpectedly, on Saturday, the 27th of March, 2021, having participated in the call ceremony only the previous Wednesday and in such fine form, John died. It's difficult to describe the shock and the sadness that has been felt by his fellow benchers and everyone here at Middle Temple at the news of John's passing. John was a great friend of mine, and I will miss his kindness, his generosity of spirit, and his good humor enormously. Over many years, John devoted so much time and energy to the affairs of the inn, generously sharing his wealth of experience, particularly with our students, when judging moots, carrying out advocacy training, and chairing scholarship interviews, including a very, very onerous 4-day event for the Bar Course scholarships. And that just names but a few. His scholarly work and lectures for the Middle Temple Historical Society, of which he was chair, will be keenly remembered. As our Lent reader, his well-known rapport with our students came to the fore. He thoroughly enjoyed the 4 call ceremonies that we did together. We spoke, both of us, to students at the virtual Cumberland Lodge that we conducted together, and his warmth and his advice were greatly appreciated by all who attended. John was such an approachable man who carried his considerable achievements so lightly. John had written an essay about Thomas Morris Chester, the first African American to be called to the English bar. Using that essay as the basis for tonight's reading, Mass Ndow-Njie and I are going to deliver it as a tribute to Master Mitchell, our Lent reader, in his memory. I have to say, I met Mass tonight in person for the first time. I had no idea he was so tall. I feel like Tom Cruise, I should have a box to stand on. It is a great pleasure that his widow Marlene is here tonight, together with her 2 sons, their wives, and her guests. Marlene, too, has served the inn by volunteering to provide counselling for services for students over so many years, and this has been greatly appreciated. Now, before we start the reading, I would just like to hand over to Mass to say a few words.
Just a few hours ago, I asked Master Treasurer if I might add a few words about the late Master Mitchell, but from a student's perspective. Last year, in the 5th month of my pupillage, I attended an advocacy course here at Middle Temple, and the late Master Mitchell was one of the teachers on that course. He delivered 2 sessions. The first was on witness handling, and the second was on closing speeches. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the man that I found. I found him to be detailed in his delivery. He didn't only offer advice about how we could become better advocates, but he was always sure to explain why his advice would help us to become successful. I found him to be thoroughly flexible. The pupils on the course were not all doing the same sort of pupilages as me. We all had different needs, but he made sure that every single person on that course left with the knowledge that they needed to move forward. He answered every question with precision, with care. Finally, I found him to be kind. I remember the first time I met him was on that course, and he pulled me aside at the beginning and said, "Mass, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard you speak at an event at Middle Temple, and I was really impressed. Keep up the good work." What he did in that moment was simply to put a smile on my face. Whenever we think about our favorite teachers, the best educators, we always find that they have these qualities: detailed delivery, thoroughly flexible, and kind. Now, I'm just one student who has benefited from Master Mitchell's work and support. But on behalf of all of those that have, I would like to say to him, to his family, thank you. And without further ado, we may start the reading.
Thomas Morris Chester, 1834 to 1892, activist, advocate, and Middle Templar, by the late Master John Mitchell. Thomas Morris Chester was called to the bar by Middle Temple on the 30th of April, 1870, and he was most likely the first African American to become an English barrister. This, however, was only one, and perhaps not the greatest, of his achievements. Throughout his life, Chester developed his talents to enable him to play a leading role in the wider Black community. At the time of his call to the English bar, he was 34 years old and had been an activist and advocate for Black rights since his teens, an educationalist in Liberia, its roving diplomat in Europe, and a newspaper war correspondent in the US Civil War. Thomas Chester was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on the 11th of May, 1834. He was the fourth of George and Jane Chester's 12 children. His father, George, owned a restaurant and may have been born a slave. His mother, Jane, had certainly been born into slavery in the South, but she escaped to the north via the Underground Railroad to Pennsylvania in 1825. Although African Americans in the northern states were free at the time of Chester's birth, they lacked citizenship, and they were often subjected to both formal and informal segregation. For them, the aim was not only securing freedom for the Southern slaves, but also achieving equality with the white communities within their own states. However, the issue of where and how this should be divided the community. Those who doubted that equality in the United States could be achieved thought that the future lay abroad in countries such as the West African state of Liberia. Their view, known as colonization, so-called, was shared by many white politicians, such as Abraham Lincoln, who notoriously made his views plain when during the Civil War he met a delegation in 1862. He said, "Even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. It is better for us both, therefore, to be separated." This issue dominated the first half of Chester's life. Until his mid-30s, he believed in colonization, writing that Liberia was the only true and natural home of our race. At the age of 19, and sponsored by the Pennsylvania Colonization Society, he sailed for Liberia for the first time. And he did so in order to further his education. However, he quickly returned to the United States after finding that the school in which he had enrolled could offer little beyond his existing level of education. But after 18 months at the Thetford Academy in Vermont, during which time he studied classics and became a very active debater, he returned to Liberia as a teacher. And that was to be the first of 3 attempts to settle in Liberia, which he made over the next 5 years. Chester found life in Liberia was not as trouble-free as he might have hoped. He encountered power struggles, both at a local level in the school in which he taught, and other power struggles in the national arena. He established a newspaper called the Star of Liberia, but he made an enemy of the Liberian president, Stephen Benson, when he published an anonymous letter criticizing Benson's administration. Matters deteriorated further when President Benson commenced court proceedings over the administration of Chester's school. Eventually, when President Benson was re-elected in 1861, Chester postponed any further attempts to settle in Liberia and returned to the United States, where most of the southern slave-owning states had seceded from the Union and the Civil War had recently begun.
The war provided the Black communities in the northern states with the opportunities not only to help free the slaves in the South, but also to secure their own recognition as US citizens. For, in the words of Frederick Douglass, once you let a Black man get upon his person the brass letters US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. But this was one of the reasons why it wasn't until January 1863, with the war going against the Union, that Lincoln allowed Black soldiers to be recruited.
Chester was eager to help, and by that summer, he was not only leading the drive to recruit African Americans in Massachusetts, but was also in charge of a company established to help repel a threatened rebel attack on Harrisburg. However, he became quickly disenchanted by the racial segregation and discrimination which was applied in the army. The African Americans were formed into so-called colored regiments. For many months, they were paid only as laborers rather than soldiers, and it was not until the last months of the war that African Americans were granted commissions. Rather than accepting such discrimination, Chester left the US in autumn of 1863 for a speaking tour in England, designed to counteract the significant British support for the Confederacy. On that tour, an official of the US Embassy wrote that he had few superiors, white or black, in the command of language and in its appropriate use. Following the tour, Chester returned to the United States in the summer of 1864, having accepted the job of a war correspondent for the Philadelphia Press. His many published newspaper reports demonstrated his strong skill as a writer. But Chester's role was not without personal danger. In 1865, when reporting from the outskirts of Richmond, he narrowly escaped being killed when a Confederate shell landed feet away from him, but fortunately failed to explode. On the 4th of April, 1865, the Union Army entered Richmond, the capital for the Confederate Army. Chester and other reporters established a press room in its Hall of Congress. He was sitting in the speaker's chair when a paroled Confederate officer entered the hall and ordered him out. When he refused to leave, the officer tried to remove him by force, only to be met by Chester knocking him to the ground before continuing to his dispatch and commenting,
I thought I would exercise my rights as a belligerent.
The end of the war did not mean the end of either segregation or racism. When hostilities ceased, Chester returned to Pennsylvania, where he helped to form the Pennsylvania State Equal Rights League. Its aims included protecting the African American community from racist attacks and promoting its interests, for example, by founding schools. Chester chaired the League's committee, which organized a 3-day event to celebrate the state's 10,000 veterans and acted as the parade's chief marshal. Even here, racism was present.
The editor of the Harrisburg Patriot labeled our celebration as the Darkies Jubilee and reported that the League wanted the niggers to vote, to hold office, to intermarry with the whites. In fact, to rule America.
Unsurprisingly, instead of remaining in the United States, Chester again left for England to raise funds for the League, but he found that anti-black sentiment had increased in England. Lectures were cancelled and contributions were poor. He therefore extended his efforts to the continent, and in particular to Russia, where Alexander II had recently abolished serfdom and was struggling with the political and economic consequences, in many ways similar to those facing the United States. Chester met greater success there than he found in England. He was introduced to the Imperial Guard in St. Petersburg, and he dined with the imperial family. Now, Chester had wanted to become a lawyer since his youth, and now, possibly because he had the money to fund his studies, although its source is uncertain, he decided to read for the English bar because it would assist his future, whether in Liberia or in the US. In June of 1867, he applied to be admitted to Middle Temple. Although he had informally studied law under the guidance of a lawyer in Liberia around 1859 to 1860, his only formal qualifications were his classical studies at the Thetford Academy in Vermont. The Inn's regulations required something more, but Chester felt himself unprepared to pass a qualifying exam in the time available. Therefore, he petitioned Parliament, the Inn's governing body, to be admitted, notwithstanding his inability to meet the usual entry requirement.
Giving an account of his circumstances and plans, he wrote, "I entreat this privilege, not so much for myself, as on behalf of the Negroes' efforts, who are struggling under many adverse circumstances to build up a commonwealth of learning, liberty, and law upon the benighted coast of Africa."
By a bare majority, the benchers granted the petition. And on the 8th of June, 1867, Thomas Morris Chester of Monrovia, the Republic of Liberia, aged 33, the third son of George Chester of Harrisburg, Dauphin, Pennsylvania, United States of America merchant, was admitted to the Inn as a student member. Although a lack of finance had been a theme in Chester's educational plans, he estimated that the cost of his education for the first year alone would be more than $700, a considerable amount of money then. He still took relatively spacious residential chambers within the inn, although at an address we currently do not know, rather than more modest rooms elsewhere. During Chester's time at the inn, he continued his work on behalf of Liberia, and in 1868 he was appointed as aide-de-camp to its then president, James Sprigg Payne. Chester's post required him to travel extensively outside of term time in an effort to promote trading and political ties with European countries. In 1868 alone, for example, on a 4-month Baltic and Scandinavian tour, he visited Brussels, Bremen, Hamburg, Stockholm, and then called Christiania, now Oslo. In early 1869, he was one of 2 commissioners employed to negotiate a trade treaty with Russia. But when Chester returned to London at the start of the Trinity term in 1869, he had a very nasty surprise. The previous November, he had placed an advertisement, possibly relating to lectures that he was giving or fundraising, in an unidentified newspaper in which he gave the address of his chambers. In so doing, he may have unintentionally breached an unwritten rule preventing barristers, which he had not yet become, advertising or using residential chambers for business purposes. As a result of a complaint, probably from another resident, Chester was given notice to quit. He offered an apology in an attempt to have his notice withdrawn, but indicated his willingness to accept the Treasurer's decision.
If in my ignorance of your forms or your etiquette, being a stranger and a foreigner, I have in this respect offended to the extent of being so summarily dealt with, I bow with that respectful fortitude to your decision, which one feels who never intended to do any wrong.
150 years later, it is surprising that in the circumstances, Chester was not even afforded an interview. However, it appears that nothing more was done, and in June 1869, Chester quit his chambers. Nonetheless, on the 30th of April 1870, having kept the required number of terms and having completed 2 courses of lectures and classes, he was called to the English bar. It is doubtful that Chester ever intended permanently to practice here, and indeed, he returned to the United States the following year, but not before distinguishing himself in December 1870 in a criminal trial at the Old Bailey, where he was briefed to defend Edward Seary on the capital charge of murdering one James Kennock. The case presented a formidable challenge for Chester and his junior, a Scots barrister called Hunter. Not only were the defense team outgunned, the prosecutor was an experienced Old Bailey advocate of at least 9 years standing. But the facts, not least that Kennock had been stabbed 7 times, presented a damning case against their client. However, despite his recent call, Chester was a confident, experienced, and mature orator, and he took great care in preparing for the trial. The 2-day trial began on the 12th of December, 1870, less than 5 weeks after Kennock's death. Among those in the public gallery were Moncure Conway, a white former Unitarian minister from Virginia, whom Chester may well have met through Conway's involvement with the cause of abolition.
His short account of the trial was written for an American newspaper and provides a possibly unique portrait of Chester. Mr. Chester, who formerly lived in Philadelphia and is very black, created a sensation when he took his place, arrayed in his white wig and black gown, among the eminent barristers who treated him with the utmost consideration.
Through skillful cross-examination, Chester and Hunter were able to persuade the jury to acquit Seary of murder. He was instead convicted of manslaughter, for which he was sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. However surprised the jury may have been to see an African American in court, they displayed no prejudice whatsoever towards him.
And Conway rightly credited this victory to Chester's skill. This Negro lawyer, by sharp cross-examination, managed to shake the evidence regarding malice and deliberation as to save his client from the gallows.
Chester returned to the United States in 1871, apparently with the intention of making his home in Pennsylvania. However, instead of settling there, he moved to Louisiana, which had the largest, free, and wealthiest black community of the Deep South, and which, ante bellum, had enjoyed far more rights, such as the ability to travel freely, than free black people in northern states. It was here rather than Pennsylvania that Chester decided to make his future. However, the political and social situation in Louisiana proved as difficult as anywhere else in the South. In addition to threats from white supremacists, Chester encountered factional difficulties within the Black political community, similar to those that he had found in Liberia, and which ultimately frustrated his personal plans in much the same way. The state Republican Party, which controlled the state government, was bitterly divided over whether to follow a program of consolidation or a more ambitious program. Chester joined its more radical wing, and this almost cost him his life. The governor favored consolidation, and after a bitterly disputed election for the lieutenant governorship, his mixed heritage candidate won, but the radicals believed that there had been a fraud. When the two factions clashed on New Year's Day, 1872, Chester was shot by a supporter of the successful candidate. Chester survived, but it seems that those responsible never faced trial. Whilst he was still recovering, in Easter 1872, over 300 white men, at the behest of the white Democrat local leaders, attacked the Colfax Parish Courthouse in Grant, murdering at least 100 Black men in what became notorious as the Colfax Massacre.
Chester was the opening speaker at a large public protest meeting in New Orleans. He spoke angrily and powerfully, outlining in detail what had occurred. We have assembled tonight not to praise our murdered dead, but to do justice to their memories. Our brethren have been savagely slaughtered after they had surrendered under the promise of protection and safety by men who are daily plighting their fidelity to our interests and soliciting us to entrust them with the administration of public affairs. When we reflect how our blood has crimsoned every parish in the state, and with the full facts of this Grant massacre before us, we solemnly ask, how long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?
Chester was more fortunate in 1873 when he supported the campaign of William Kellogg, who was elected the governor. He was rewarded with a series of appointments. First, he was appointed as Brigadier General in the state militia, whose function was to support the civilian police authorities after federal troops had been withdrawn. Secondly, he was appointed as the first African-American superintendent of public education for two states' divisions. His task as superintendent was a particularly difficult one. School budgets had been cut by a third. Teachers were poorly paid, and in consequence, he was forced to recommend the closure of some of the schools.
Nevertheless, he was praised for his efforts by one Jacques Glas, the state's first ever African-American senator. Glas said, "Chester manages his office with more propriety and regularity than any of his predecessors, and his appointment is looked on with pride by the colored people all over his district."
However, as in Liberia, Chester's appointments depended upon the patronage of those in power. And therefore, when the Democrats gained control of the state in 1877, his appointments also came to an end. Before that time, in 1873, Chester had begun practicing law in the United States. He had been admitted to the Louisiana bar and had quickly made a reputation for himself, defending 3 poor Black men charged with murder. Unlike the Old Bailey case that he'd conducted in England 3 years earlier, his address to the jury this time was recorded.
While defending his clients in Louisiana, he said, "That they are poor is their misfortune. That they've been accused with this crime is not their fault, and the responsibility of being Black is assumed by him who created them after his own image. And it would not be a violation of your oaths if you permitted either of these circumstances to influence your judgment against the accused. But it would be an everlasting disgrace upon the administration of public justice in Louisiana.
In another notable case, Chester also successfully appealed the conviction of a man accused of murdering a planter. The defendant was eventually acquitted on the retrial that followed. As with his political activities, Chester was concerned not only with establishing himself, but promoting the interests of his community. The earlier cases under the Louisiana Equal Rights and Privilege legislation, which prohibited discrimination on public transport and places of a public character, such as theatres and restaurants, were brought by litigants who generally enjoyed a relatively high status and had the support of white acquaintances. Now poorer people could be represented by Chester, one of the few lawyers to do so. The damages awarded by the courts were usually low, but not in the case of a schoolteacher named Emily Lowbray. She asked to be served in a confectionery and was told that she would have to sit upstairs. When she complied and went upstairs, she was told that she had to order downstairs, but downstairs service was refused to her again. Chester helped her to secure damages of $200, again, a significant sum at that time. In taking on these types of cases, Chester had the aim not just of securing compensation for his clients, but making the case against discrimination generally. Sadly, when the Democrats took political control of the state in 1877, the Equal Rights and Privileges legislation became ineffective. Indeed, the path was laid open for the segregation codes of the Jim Crow era, which would last until at least the Civil Rights Act of 1965. In 1879, Chester, now in his mid-40s, married Florence Johnson, a 23-year-old who was a schoolteacher. They had a son named Morris, who would go on to become a professor. Thereafter, Chester spent much of his time in Harrisburg and was no longer involved in state government, although he did manage to secure 2 short-lived federal appointments. However, he continued to practice law, dividing his time between Louisiana and Pennsylvania after he was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1881. Chester is understood to have died on the 30th of September, 1892, after a heart attack at his mother's home in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
He was buried in a segregated cemetery in Harrisburg. He was later described by a newspaper as one of the most accomplished colored men of his period.
It would be unfortunate if Chester were to be remembered only as the first African American to be called to the English bar. He achieved so much throughout his life. His membership of the Middle Temple was discovered almost by accident when in the late 1980s, Professor R.J.M. Blackett was preparing his Civil War dispatches for publication. Chester was not entirely unique in this sense. His life story shares features common to some other 19th and early 20th century law students or barristers of direct or indirect African heritage who came after him. They were transients who came to London for education and to qualify before returning to their countries of origin to practice. For many, becoming a lawyer was only part of their identity, and they were often active in politics and Pan-American and African affairs. It was only through these other activities that they have been identified as members of the Inns of Court. And so the label of being the first can serve to distort a rounded view of Chester's life. Although he may have self-identified as a lawyer, his life story shows that he was so much more: an activist, an educator, a politician, and a journalist who twice served as a member of the military. His story is one of adventure and complexity. Homer's description of Odysseus, which Chester may well have read as a classics student, seems an appropriate epitaph.
This was a man of wide-ranging spirit who had wandered long and far. Many were those whose cities he viewed and whose minds he came to know. Many the troubles that vexed his heart as he sailed the seas, laboring to save himself and his comrades.
Thank you.